She had built a $4.2 million catering business from a single folding table outside a Birmingham church, and the morning they found her unconscious on the kitchen floor of her own restaurant, not one person from her inner circle came. Not her business partner of 11 years. Not the son she had put through culinary school. Not the daughter who ran the front of house and knew every reservation by heart. The only person who showed up was a woman who had not worked for her in 4 years. She arrived at UAB Hospital at 6:47 in the morning, carrying a mason jar of sweet tea and a paper bag. She sat down in the waiting room chair nearest the window, and she did not leave. Her name was Vivian Okafor. She was 58. She had been Ruth Callaway's line cook. Ruth Callaway had grown up in Bessemer, Alabama, which is the kind of town people describe by what left it rather than what stayed. The steel mill closed when Ruth was 11. Her father stayed anyway, working 2 jobs that together paid less than the one that had gone. Her mother cleaned offices downtown, 3 buildings, 5 nights a week, never complaining, never explaining, simply moving through each task the way water moves through a room it has flooded, completely, without announcement. Ruth learned to cook from necessity. There were 4 children and a budget that required creativity rather than abundance. She learned that dried beans took longer but cost less and fed more. She learned that a little fat and a lot of patience could make almost anything worth eating. She learned, most importantly, that feeding people was not a service. It was a language. It was how her family said, "We are still here. We are still together. Come sit down." She started catering at 29 with a borrowed truck and a menu of 7 items she could make with her eyes closed. Church events, family reunions, the occasional birthday party for someone's grandmother who wanted real food, and not something that arrived in a refrigerated van. She charged fairly. She showed up early. She stayed until the last table was cleared and the last guest had eaten. By the time she was 42, Callaway's Kitchen had a storefront on 20th Street South in Birmingham. By 47, she had 3 catering vans, a prep kitchen, and a staff of 14. By 52, she had been written up in Birmingham Magazine and had catered 2 fundraisers for the governor's office and 1 rehearsal dinner for a family whose name appeared on the side of a hospital wing. What Birmingham Magazine did not write about was the rest of it. She had a son, Devon, 31, who had graduated from Johnson & Wales with a degree in culinary arts that Ruth had paid for in full over 4 years of installments she never mentioned and never asked to be thanked for. Devon ran the back kitchen at Callaway's. He had strong opinions about technique and weaker opinions about punctuality. Ruth had given him the position because she believed, as she had believed about many things, that proximity to responsibility would eventually produce it. She was still waiting. She had a daughter, Janelle, 28, who managed reservations and vendor relationships, and the front of house with a competence that Ruth had not had to teach her and a coldness she had not taught her either. Janelle was efficient in the way of someone who has decided that warmth is a liability. She moved through the restaurant as though she were auditing it rather than running it. Ruth's business partner was a man named Gerald Foss. They had met 15 years earlier when Gerald had come to her catering truck at a corporate luncheon and spent 40 minutes asking her questions about her pricing model and her sourcing strategy. He had offered to invest 6 months later. She had said no twice and yes the 3rd time because he asked the 3rd time the same way he had asked the first, without pressure, without urgency, simply as a person who believed in something and was waiting for the other person to catch up. Gerald had been useful for a decade. Then he had become comfortable. Then comfort had become the kind of quiet erosion that is harder to name than conflict, because it looks from the outside like everything is fine. Ruth had known for 2 years that something was wrong. She had not said it out loud yet. She had the habit, learned from her mother, of moving toward the next thing that needed doing rather than stopping to examine the thing already done. It was an efficient way to live. It was not always an honest one. Vivian Okafor had come to Callaway's Kitchen 7 years earlier through a church connection. She was a cook in the institutional sense, She had spent 12 years feeding 300 people a day in a hospital cafeteria before that hospital downsized its food service operation and let her go with 2 weeks' pay and a handshake that meant nothing. She was 51 when she walked into Ruth's prep kitchen for the trial shift. She had no resume that would impress anyone. She had hands that knew what they were doing and a palate that did not need to be told twice. Ruth had hired her on the spot. For 7 years, Vivian worked the morning prep shift. She arrived at 5:10 a.m., before the trucks were loaded, before the coffee was made, before anyone else was in the building. She had a key because Ruth had given her one after the 3rd week because Vivian had mentioned, once and without complaint, that she had been waiting outside the locked door for 40 minutes on a Tuesday when the morning supervisor was late. Ruth had handed her the key the next day. No ceremony. Just, here. Vivian had kept that key for 7 years, including the 4 years after she no longer worked there. The reason Vivian no longer worked at Callaway's kitchen was Gerald Foss. 18 months after Devon joined the staff, Gerald had proposed a restructuring: fewer permanent employees, more contract labor, lower fixed costs. He had spreadsheets. He had projections. He had the kind of language that makes a room feel like the decision has already been made, and the meeting is simply a formality. Devon had nodded along. Janelle had asked 2 questions, both about her own position. Ruth had listened to all of it and had said she needed time. Gerald had given her 3 days. On the 4th day, he had sent a list. 8 names, the 8 employees whose positions would be eliminated in the restructuring. Vivian Okafor was second on the list. Ruth had not fired her. She had sat Vivian down in the small office off the prep kitchen, the one with the window that faced the alley, and she had told her the truth. Someone with more power in the business had decided this. She did not agree with it. She was saying so now because Vivian deserved to hear it from her directly, not through a letter, not through Devon, not through an HR process conducted by a woman in the corporate office who had never met her. Vivian had listened. She had not cried. She had not argued. She had said, "I know you didn't choose this." Then she had stood up, gone back to the prep kitchen, and finished her shift. Ruth had placed 2 extra months of pay in Vivian's final envelope. No note, no explanation. It was just there when Vivian opened it. They had not spoken much after that. Vivian had found a position at a hotel restaurant downtown. She had moved to an apartment in Homewood, smaller than what she'd had before, but close to her sister, who was getting older and needed checking on. She had a daughter in Memphis who called every Sunday. She had a life that was smaller than it had been and quieter and more careful in the way lives become when they have absorbed enough disruption to know that stability is not something you take for granted. She still had the key to Callaway's kitchen in the drawer of her nightstand. She had not returned it because Ruth had never asked for it back, and she had not thrown it away because throwing it away felt like a decision she wasn't ready to make. The morning Ruth collapsed, it was a Thursday in early October. She had been in the prep kitchen alone, which she did sometimes when she needed to think with her hands instead of her head. She had been making biscuits, the kind her mother used to make, lard and white lily flour and buttermilk, and the particular wrist motion she had learned by watching rather than being taught. She had been making them because the previous day had been the worst day in the business she had spent 23 years building, and she did not know yet what she was going to do about it. The day before, an auditor had called. Not one of Gerald's people, an independent firm. Ruth had requested the audit herself 6 weeks earlier because there were numbers that did not sit right, and she had learned, in 23 years of business, to trust her own discomfort even when she could not explain it. The auditor's findings were not complicated. Gerald Foss had been routing vendor payments through a subsidiary account that existed primarily on paper. Over 4 years, the discrepancy totaled slightly above $340,000. He had done it carefully, incrementally, in amounts small enough not to trigger automated flags. He had done it the way a patient person does something wrong. Slowly, consistently, banking on the likelihood that the person he was doing it to was too busy to look closely. Ruth had looked closely. She had also looked at Devon's timesheets for the past 2 years. There were patterns there too, though smaller and less calculated. The patterns of a person who believed his position was permanent regardless of effort, and had adjusted his effort accordingly. She had driven home that night and she had not spoken to anyone about what she had found. She had gone to sleep, and she had woken at 4 in the morning, and she had driven to the restaurant, and she had started making biscuits because she did not yet know how to be angry and afraid at the same time. And making biscuits was the one thing she knew how to do that required her whole attention and left no room for anything else. At 6:22 in the morning, she fell. The paramedics arrived in 9 minutes. They found her on the floor between the prep table and the oven, conscious but unable to stand, her hands still dusted with flour. The diagnosis at UAB was a transient ischemic attack, a TI, what some call a mini-stroke, a disruption of blood flow to the brain that had, in Ruth's case, lasted long enough to take her legs out from under her, but not long enough to take anything else. She was lucky, the attending physician told her. The word luck landed in Ruth's ears the way it always had, as something that happened to other people by accident, rather than something she had experienced on purpose. She had never felt lucky. She had felt prepared or unprepared, ready or not ready. Luck had always seemed like something you said when you didn't know what else to say. Gerald was called at 7:15. He listened to the nurse's summary and said he would come when he could. He did not come that day. He sent a text at 4 in the afternoon that said, "Hope you're recovering well. Let me know what you need." Devon was called at 7:20. He said he had a prep list he couldn't leave. He said he'd come by after service. He did not come after service. He texted at 9 p.m. "How are you feeling? Let me know if you need anything." Janelle was called at 7:30. She asked whether Ruth had signed anything that morning, and if not, who had authority to approve the Thursday evening event. She did not come at all. She sent a single text the next morning. "Hope you're feeling better. I handled Thursday." Vivian Okafor was not called. No one thought to call her. She had not worked at Callaway's kitchen in 4 years, and she no longer appeared on any contact list associated with the business. She found out because her sister, who lived 6 blocks from the restaurant, had seen the ambulance and texted her a photo of the parking lot. Vivian had been awake. It was 6:47 in the morning. She had been making tea. She looked at the photo. She looked at it for a long moment. She put the kettle on the back burner. She filled a mason jar with sweet tea she had already made. She put on her good shoes, the ones she wore for church, because a hospital deserved the same effort. She drove to UAB. She parked in the visitor lot. She went to the 4th floor. She was told she was not family. She said, "I know." She asked if anyone had been there that morning. There was a pause at the nurse's station then. "No, not yet." Vivian sat down in the chair nearest the window. She put her mason jar on the side table. She put the paper bag, which had biscuits she had made herself that morning, on her lap, and she waited. Ruth's room was on the 4th floor, east wing. It had a window that faced a small courtyard, and in the mornings the light came in at an angle that turned the linoleum floor golden for about 40 minutes before it moved on to the wall. Ruth had noticed this on the first morning. She had nothing else to do but notice things. She was sitting up in the bed, her back against 2 pillows, when the nurse came in on the second morning and said, "The woman who was here yesterday is back. She brought food. Says she's an old colleague." Ruth said. "What's her name?" The nurse said. "Vivian. Says she knows how you take your tea." Ruth was quiet for a moment. The light was on the floor, moving slowly toward the wall. She said, "Send her in." Vivian came in with the mason jar and the paper bag and a folding chair she had brought herself because she had worked in enough places to know there was never a chair in the right spot when you needed one. She set up the chair beside the bed. She put the mason jar on the bedside table. She opened the paper bag, biscuits. Ruth looked at them. They were the same kind she had been making when she fell. Lard and white lily and the particular golden color that comes from a cast iron pan properly seasoned, not from a baking sheet. Ruth looked at them for a long time. Then she said, "You didn't have to do this," Vivian said. "I know," Ruth said. "How did you find out?" Vivian said. My sister saw the ambulance. Ruth looked at the biscuits again. She said, Gerald didn't come. Vivian said nothing. She poured sweet tea from the mason jar into the plastic cup from Ruth's bedside tray and handed it to her. Ruth drank. She looked out the window at the small courtyard where a maintenance worker was moving a trash can slowly across the concrete. She said, Devon didn't come either, Vivian said. I know. They sat for a while without talking. The light moved off the floor and onto the wall. The courtyard below was quiet. On the third morning, Vivian brought coffee instead. She had learned Ruth's preference years ago. Strong, no sugar, the smallest amount of cream that still counted as cream. She had remembered it the way she remembered all the preferences of the people she had worked for. Not from effort, from attention, the kind of attention that becomes second nature when you spend years caring about the quality of what you put in front of someone. Ruth watched her set out the cup. She said, You kept those details all this time. Vivian said, I kept a lot of things. She reached into her jacket pocket and set something on the bedside table beside the cup. It was a key, small, brass, worn at the edges from years of being carried without being used. Ruth looked at it. She said, You still have that. Vivian said, You never asked for it back. Ruth was quiet. The coffee was good. The room was quiet in the way hospital rooms are quiet early in the morning, before the corridor fills up and the carts begin rolling. She said, The day Gerald put you on that list, I went home and I didn't sleep. Vivian said, I know you didn't choose it. Ruth said, I chose to let it happen. That's the same thing. Vivian looked at her. She said, No, it isn't. But I appreciate that you know the difference. On the fourth day, a woman came to the hospital who was not family and not a former employee. She was a partner in the law firm that handled Callaway's kitchens contracts. Her name was Deborah Sattler, and Gerald Foss had called her first. She came to the fourth floor with a leather portfolio and asked to speak with Ruth about business continuity arrangements and whether Ruth had considered a power of attorney for business decisions given the uncertain recovery timeline. Ruth listened to all of it. She asked one question. Who called you? Deborah said. Gerald reached out this morning. He wanted to make sure things were handled properly while you're recovering. Ruth said, Thank you for coming. I'll be in touch. Deborah left. Ruth sat in the chair by the window for a while. She had not told anyone at the hospital about the audit. She had not told anyone what she had found in the accounts. She had been trying to decide, in the quiet of that room, whether to be methodical or furious, and which one would serve her better. The next morning, Vivian arrived to find Ruth dressed, sitting in the chair with her reading glasses on, working through a printed spreadsheet that the nurse's station had helped her print from her email. Vivian sat down. She said nothing. She poured coffee, Ruth said, without looking up. He took $340,000 over 4 years. He did it in amounts small enough to look like vendor variants. Vivian said, How long have you known? Ruth said, I suspected for 2 years. I confirmed it 6 weeks ago. I hadn't figured out what to do about it yet. Vivian said, What are you going to do? Ruth put the spreadsheet down. She took off her reading glasses. She looked at the window at the courtyard where the same maintenance worker was doing something with a hose now, unhurried, moving through his morning, the way people move through mornings that belong entirely to them. She said, I'm going to take back what's mine, all of it. She was in the hospital for 9 days. The TI had not left lasting damage. Her speech was intact. Her cognition was intact. Her hands were steady when she held the coffee cup. She had been running too hard for too long without sleeping enough or eating properly, or pausing long enough to notice that her body was sending messages she had been too busy to read. The attending physician told her she was fortunate. She said, I know. Vivian came every morning for all 9 days. She brought food each time, not the same thing twice, but always something Ruth would have made herself. Sweet potato soup in a thermos on day 5, cornbread wrapped in foil on day 6. The particular kind of deviled eggs that Ruth's mother used to make with a little cider vinegar and more paprika than most people used. Vivian had eaten them once at a staff meal 17 years ago, and she had remembered them the way she remembered everything. Not consciously, but with a kind of body knowledge that does not require effort to maintain. On day 7, Devin came. He had heard, through Janelle, that someone had mentioned the audit to a board member. He did not know yet what the audit had found. He came to the hospital with flowers he had purchased from the hospital gift shop and a practiced expression of concern that had the particular quality of something performed for an audience rather than felt. He sat in the chair beside the bed. He said, "Mom, we've been worried." Ruth looked at him. She said, "Who is we?" He said, "Me and Janelle. We wanted to give you space to recover." Ruth said, "It's been 7 days," Devin said. "We've been keeping things running." "Gerald has been," Ruth said. "Don't." The room was very quiet. Devin looked at his flowers. He put them on the bedside table beside Vivian's mason jar, which was still there from the morning. He looked at the jar. He said, "Who's been coming to see you?" Ruth said, "Someone who came on day 1. She told him about the audit 3 days after she was discharged. She did it in her office at Callaway's kitchen, across the desk from where he sat in the chair with his elbows on his knees and his hands clasped in the posture of a man who already knows what is coming and has decided to look cooperative rather than defensive. She told Gerald in the same room 2 hours later. Gerald did not look cooperative. Gerald looked like a man calculating distance between where he was and where the door was. He started with an explanation. Ruth let him finish, then she said, "I've spoken to my attorney. You'll hear from her." She did not yell. She did not cry. She had spent 9 days in a hospital room deciding who she was going to be when she came out of it. And who she was going to be was not a woman who wasted her voice on people who had already shown her what they were worth. Gerald was removed from the business. His name was taken off the accounts. The legal process was slow and would get slower before it resolved. Ruth had known, going in, that there would be no clean ending, only a long one. Devin was not fired. She loved him. That had not changed. She told him what she had told Gerald Foss, only in the sense that she told him the truth. That his position had been handed to him rather than earned by him. And that the difference between those two things had become visible in the worst week of her life. And she was not willing to continue pretending otherwise. She gave him a choice. He could start at the beginning, the way she had started, the way every person who builds something real has to start, or he could leave and find somewhere else that would give him a position he had not worked for. Devin was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "That's going to be hard." Ruth said, "Yes." He stayed. Whether he would grow into it the way she had grown into the buildings by standing in them long enough, she did not know yet. She was watching. She was waiting. She had gotten more patient in the years since she had learned that patience and passivity are not the same thing. Janelle was a more complicated conversation. Janelle had not stolen anything. Janelle had simply been absent, efficient in her presence, and absent in every way that mattered. Ruth told her this plainly, without drama, the way she had learned to say difficult things, not as an accusation, but as a fact that required acknowledgement before anything else could move forward. Janelle said, "I thought you were fine. You always seem fine," Ruth said. "I know. I taught you that by accident. I was trying to teach you that things get handled. I didn't mean to teach you that the person handling things doesn't need anything." Janelle looked at her hands. She said, "I didn't know you were struggling," Ruth said. "I know you didn't. I'm telling you now." 6 weeks after her discharge, Ruth drove to Homewood on a Saturday morning. She parked on the street outside a brick apartment building with a small garden in front that someone had clearly tended with care. Herbs in a window box, a pot of chrysanthemums by the entrance, the particular neatness of a person who believes that where they live says something about who they are. Vivian answered the door in her house clothes, the kind of worn soft fabric that means someone is at home in the truest sense of the word. Behind her, the apartment was small and orderly and warm in a way that had nothing to do with the temperature. She stepped aside without saying, "Come in." Ruth walked in. She looked at the kitchen. She looked at the table, a small 1-2 chairs, positioned near the window where the morning light was coming through in a warm band across the surface. She sat down. Vivian went to the stove. Ruth said, "I'm starting a foundation." Vivian poured coffee into 2 plain mugs, the kind heavy enough to hold something real. She set one in front of Ruth. She sat down across from her. Ruth said, "For food service workers, healthcare, housing assistance, emergency funds for people who work the early shift and the late shift, and the jobs nobody sees and who fall through every gap because the system that built itself on their labor never thought to build a floor underneath them." Vivian looked at her coffee. She said, "That's a lot," Ruth said. "It's not enough, but it's a start," she said. "I want to name it the Okafor Fund." Vivian looked up. She was still for a moment. She said, "You don't have to do that," Ruth said. "I want the name of someone who showed up. Not someone who showed up with a lawyer or a leather folder. Someone who showed up with biscuits and their own chair and a key they had kept for 4 years in a nightstand drawer." Vivian looked at the window. The light had moved off the table now, was reaching the counter. She turned the mug slowly in her hands. She said, "My mother was a line cook for 31 years. Ruth said, "I didn't know that." Vivian said, "She never owned anything. She made everything possible for people who owned everything, and she never had a safety net. When she got sick, she worked until she couldn't." She said, "I would have liked for there to have been something." The 2 women sat in the kitchen for a while after that. The coffee cooled. The light moved the way light moves in a room where no one is in a hurry. Ruth reached into her coat pocket. She took out a key. It was a new one, cut fresh, not the old brass one from the nightstand. She placed it on the table between them. She said, "I want you to come back, not as a line cook, as operations director. The kitchen runs right when you're in it. It always did. I just didn't say that out loud." Vivian looked at the key. She did not pick it up immediately. She looked at it the way a person looks at something they have wanted without letting themselves want it. Then she picked it up. She folded her hand around it. She said, "5 a.m.? Ruth said, "5 a.m. They finished the coffee. They did not talk about Gerald Foss. They did not talk about Devon or Janelle or the audit or the long legal process ahead. Those things existed and would continue to exist and would require attention for months and possibly years. But they were not what the morning was for. The morning was for 2 women sitting at a small table in a kitchen in Homewood, Alabama, one of whom had built something real from nothing and fallen and was getting back up, and one of whom had shown up every day for 9 days with food and a folding chair and a key she had never thrown away, and neither of them needed to say out loud what that meant because it was already in the room. Outside the window, Homewood was moving through its Saturday. Someone's was walking a dog. Someone was backing a car out of a driveway. The ordinary machinery of a morning that most people would not remember. Inside the kitchen, something was being put back together that had been coming apart for longer than either of them had admitted. There is a kind of loyalty that does not announce itself. It does not send texts that say, "Let me know if you need anything." It does not arrive with a leather portfolio or a business continuity plan. It shows up at 6:47 in the morning with a mason jar and its own chair, and it sits down without being asked, and it does not leave. The people in your life who have that, you know who they are, not because they told you, because they were there when no one else was. Write their name somewhere, you will see it. Not as a reminder, as a record. They earned it.